that it's not enough to understand why the US, especially why the US has maintained the position throughout the years. Okay? So, so my second part, the second part of my talk, we focus on the geopolitical reasons, the one that I've just mentioned. I'll say a few words about them. Then I will focus on Washington, D.C. and on what I call political reasons, especially lobbying. And then I will focus, and that'll be the last part of my talk, on the reasons that relate to memory and to the way the US deals with history in general, and in part, and especially with the dark pages of history, of its own history and of history in general. That'll be the last part of my talk. So first, a few words about the state of the Armenian genocide recognition in the United States. So, I can't develop much on history, but as you know or may know, the US of President Wilson supported quite firmly the Armenians during the genocide, and especially immediately after, in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, both from a political point of view and humanitarian point of view. This support soon decreased. In the late 20s and in the 30s, the support to the Armenians decreased. And the Armenians and the massacre they experienced were somewhat forgotten by the US and by US diplomacy, and by the rest of the world too, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And when the question of the Armenian massacres and the idea of justice for the Armenians emerged again, mostly after World War II and the Jewish Holocaust, and even more after 1965, Turkey had become a major ally of the United States. So when the Armenians started to ask for justice and for the recognition of the genocide, and when Turkey started to vehemently oppose this recognition, the US executive branch decided not to take the risk to hurt Turkey and refused to use the term genocide to qualify the 1915 massacres. And soon, the executive branch also decided to oppose any federal and sometimes even state and local institutions that tried to recognize the Armenian genocide. So this situation was, of course, unacceptable for the Armenian American community. And Armenian Americans started, especially from the early 70s, to lobby in Washington, D.C. to obtain such a recognition by the US. And eventually they obtained significant results. So to make it simple and to make it simple and short, or to try to make it short, we can say that today in the US, almost everyone and almost every US institution recognize the Armenian genocide. Almost everyone, but except a few denialists or lobbyists close to Ankara. So you still have a few people who do not recognize the Armenian genocide. But again, most of the time the links with Ankara has been clearly identified and proved. And then you have, politically speaking, the executive branch of the federal government, except on rare exceptions, and some institutions that are under the immediate pressure of the executive government, of the executive branch, pardon me, which have not recognized the Armenian genocide neither. And incredibly enough, among these institutions being under some sort of pressure from the executive, you have the Congress, you have the legislative branch. So that's why basically you have no law resolution recognizing the genocide has been passed in Congress. So concretely speaking, it means that at the political level, 48 of the 50 states of the US, of the Union, have recognized the Armenian genocide. A significant number of towns, cities, counties all across the country have also recognized it. At the federal level, one president of the US, Ronald Reagan, used once the word genocide, the term genocide, to talk of the Armenian massacres. It was in 1981. One ambassador to Armenia, John Marshall Evans, did the same in 2005, and then he was not fired, but he was forced to resign a few months later. Forced, of course, by the State Department, by his hierarchy at the State Department. And you have also one interesting document published in released in 1951 by the State Department, which also mentioned the word genocide as early as 1951. The Congress also has a strong record on the question. The House of Representatives alone, and also some congressional committees and congressional commissions have voted texts recognizing the genocide. But, as I said before, mostly because of pressures from the executive, Congress has not been able to vote a resolution, and therefore no law made clear that the US nation recognized or recognizes the Armenian genocide. And what's interesting, and so I can develop on the process, but what's interesting is that congressmen have tried many, many times. And the first attempt, I think, dates back to 75, pardon me, 75. And since 75, they've tried probably more than 10 times to pass such a legislation. Okay? So this idea of duration is extremely interesting to me. So, of course, the question is why the US Congress cannot pass a legislation affirming the Armenian genocide, and why the executive not only is reluctant to recognize the genocide, but also pressures very hard Congress not to pass such a law. That's also an interesting point. We could imagine that, and that's what happened in France actually, that at some point the executive says that they don't agree on the principle, but don't directly pressure congressmen. Just let them do this. They say, we personally, if I may, disagree, but do your job, do what you have to do. Their position is even tougher than this one. They oppose and they fight against congressmen who want to recognize the Armenian genocide. So I can't develop, we can discuss this very point later if you're interested, but I can't insist much. But anyway, this is the question. Why and how? So the first point, and this is the second part of my talk, is about geopolitics. Okay, so this sort of central argument, which is a good one, a fair argument, and I think it needs to be discussed and developed and so on. So that's what I'm going to do briefly here. So basically, this is the first reason that comes to mind, and that is constantly repeated by most observers and in the media. And of course, it relates to Turkey's geopolitical importance. So, it is true that Turkey has been, since the early Cold War, and since its integration to NATO in 1951-52, a major geopolitical ally of the United States, and also an important economic partner, or geo-economic partner of the US. It is true that the US has used several military bases in Turkey, and today especially uses the one of Incirlik in the south of Turkey, where several southern US soldiers are based, are stationed, but also equipment, planes, and even some nuclear missiles. It is also true that intelligence sharing between both countries is said to be significant at a very high level. It is also true that Turkey has historically been one of the only allies of Israel, very close to the US, in the region. It is also true that Turkey is an oil and gas hub, and that the US and Turkey are trade partners, and that involves strategic sectors such as the arms industry. So all that is true and well known. I mean, that would be interesting to work more on it, and hopefully that's what I will do. But basically, this is true and well known. But this sort of big geopolitical argument can also be easily questioned. First, is Turkey today such a close and reliable geopolitical partner as it used to be in the 20th century? Second point or second question, even if it is or even if it were, is Turkey really so indispensable to the US from a geopolitical point of view? In any case, although Turkey has been threatening very hard the US of geopolitical retaliation if it recognized the Armenian genocide, will it really move into action? I mean, we have the precedent of France, which is of major interest. France recognized the Armenian genocide, and then what happened to France? Not much. I'm simplifying, but very much. But still, this is the idea. So, other important point and other important question, in the end, which partner has more to lose of a possible cooling off of the bilateral relations between the US and Turkey? And again, you can guess my answer. So this geopolitical argument is important and it is fair, I'd say, but is much more problematic and complex than it may appear at first glance. Of course, this is not to say that Turkey is not an important partner for the US, but there is no evidence that first, it is not so indispensable, especially today, and second, that it would drastically cool off its relations with the US if the US recognizes the Armenian genocide. So in the end, although it must be taken into account that this geopolitical argument is central, but to me, this argument is not enough to understand the firmness and the consistency of Washington's, especially the executive's, position. So to get some other elements of answer, we need, in my opinion, to zoom in on, Washington, D.C. And this is the third part of my talk. So Washington, D.C. Indeed, if the US does not recognize the Armenian genocide, it is also because of a special and complex situation in DC. First and foremost, you have the lobbying factor. So it would belong to develop, but basically the idea is that Turkey has constantly, massively, and we could say skillfully, lobbied both the executive branch and also the Congress, and has done it for decades. The first type of pressure, of course, is a sort of the idea of threatening Washington with diplomatic and geopolitical consequences and retaliation in case of a recognition. As early as 1975, there are records of the Turkish ambassador in Washington, D.C., meeting directly with the then House Majority Leader, Tip O'Neill, who supported the resolution recognizing the genocide, to try to influence him. More recently, in 2007, 2009, in reaction to congressional committee votes in favor of a recognition, Turkey has recalled its ambassador to Washington for consultations. Meanwhile, Turkey has also spent huge amounts of money to influence US elected officials, not only elected officials, but especially elected officials. For example, according to one source, in the late 80s, Turkey has long had, and I'm quoting, has long had a $1 million a year public relations contract with famous lobbying firm Hill and Knowlton. Then in '99, another example, Turkey had an annual lobbying budget in the US of more than $2 million a year. And at that time it was huge. It put Turkey in league with countries as South Africa and South Korea. So this lobbying, and especially this lobbying money, was not only directed towards the Armenian genocide question, but the Armenian genocide question and recognition question was one of the issues dealt with. I could multiply these examples of Turkish lobbying in DC. I won't do it because it'd be a bit long. I mean, in the 2000 and the 2010s, Turkey was also extremely active and has been extremely active also. That is to say, these past few years, these past 2 decades. And they got close to famous lobbyists as Robert Livingston. I mean, got close, they hired Robert Livingston, Dick Gafford, former Speaker of the House and controversial character Dennis Hastert, and also former CIA Director Porter Goss. So all these people have lobbied for Turkey, and these 4 ones with a special focus, I'd say, on the Armenian question. The Washington Post stated in 2010 that, I'm quoting, "The Turkish government has spent millions on Washington lobbying over the past decade, much of it focused on the Armenian genocide issue. Turkey has also focused very much on influencing the media, also university circles." I can't insist on these points, but they're also of great interest. So in the end, this active lobbying, although it was countered by the Armenians, has clearly permitted Turkish positions to be heard in DC, has clearly permitted Turkey to gain influence and to secure some alliances with policymakers in Washington, D.C. Apart from this lobbying thing, which is important to me, but still, there is another reason proper to Washington, D.C., and especially to the State Department, I would say, I would like to insist on. It is what we could call the force of inertia of big institutions. Among the different characteristics of this force of inertia that does not help the genocide to be recognized in DC, it seems that there is the fact that a few important and powerful people, especially in the State Department, see this recognition of the Armenian genocide as a source of potential complication to them, to their work, to their almost everyday work, I should say. And of course, this is not only my idea. There are already 2 people, former State Department officials, who told me that it was clearly part of the problem. In a way, they prefer to maintain a sort of statu quo situation because they know how to deal with it. And yeah, it's easier for them to keep it this way. Finally, and I'll make it short, but I think it's interesting too, as far as Washington, D.C. is concerned, we can also consider that the Armenian genocide recognition has been a sort of victim of the progressive but inexorable loss of influence of the Congress vis-à-vis the executive. The fact that Congress is more and more partisan and under the influence of the executive or of party leaders clearly does not help when it comes to voting a lot. Okay, so I'm going to stop here with this political and geopolitical aspects. I think you got the idea. I think they're important. But again, I think so they're central to, and they explain in large part why the US has not fully recognized the Armenian genocide. But in my opinion, another parameter should also be taken into account, and never is, to my knowledge, or almost never, the role that the Armenian genocide plays and may play, if it's recognized, in US political, social, and memory life. So that'd be the last part of my talk, the Armenian genocide, memory issues, in the United States. So, indeed, the US recognition of the Armenian genocide should also be considered as part of a broader picture that relates to the way the US deals with history, and especially the dark pages of history, and even more the ones that may have an impact on political and social stability, both at the national and international levels. These aspects are, in my opinion, more central than what we assume, what we may assume at first glance. My main idea here is that some people in DC might fear, more or less consciously, that might fear more or less consciously the possible consequences of a recognition of the Armenian genocide. So these aspects are interesting and important to study, but in the meantime they are very sensitive and they're also difficult to study. So I'm dealing with them very carefully, and I must say that this part of my research is definitely a work in progress. But still I think it's important to discuss these points too. So the starting point of my analysis insists on the fact that the US has a difficult relationship with its own past. The darkest episodes of US history, namely the ones that concern the fate of American Indians and African Americans, are not really settled and in fact are not much dealt with. And as an outsider, as a foreigner, that's something I can tell you guys. I mean, I'm sometimes surprised by the fact that Native Americans are, in their memory, are not more part of our everyday life here in Los Angeles. But anyway, so this is the beginning of my reflection on this topic. So these issues are not discussed, of course, politically, but even when it comes to memorialization, they are not dealt with very much neither. And in these two cases, African Americans and Indians, American Indians, and possibly in others, and I'm thinking in particular of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, you have people, and now more and more serious people, scholars, who talk of genocide or possible genocide or genocidal episodes or processes and so on, perpetrated by the US, in and by the US. Meanwhile, we know that the US has been extremely reluctant to sign, and even more to ratify, of course, the UN Convention of 1948 on genocide. And let me remind you the title of this convention, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So the US eventually ratified this convention, but only in 1988 through President Reagan. So it means 40 years after the initial signature of the document. But still nothing terrible happened to the US after this ratification. But it seemed that people in DC hesitated quite much before doing it. This point to me is even more relevant because we know that Turkey plays this card too, in order to try to prevent international recognition of the Armenian genocide. They basically threaten countries which are about to recognize the Armenian genocide to then recognize a genocide or possible genocide perpetrated by this or this country. They've done that with the US quite much, especially at the end of the 90s when Bill Clinton pressured Congress not to pass a law in the year 2000 actually. They threatened to Ankara, the Grand Assembly of Turkey, threatened to recognize an American genocide of Native Americans. Plus, we also know that Turkey builds strong links with some native tribes. So that's also an interesting aspect. In the same vein, in the same kind of ideas, we observe that some leaders of the Turkish caucus in DC oppose Armenian genocide resolution, arguing that instead of dealing with the history of others, Congress should focus on the failing of of US history, such as, of course, slavery or the killing of Native Americans. And I'm quoting here Representative Meeks, M-E-E-K-S, Gregory Meeks. He said that in 2007, and that's interesting that Meeks is an African American Democrat representative from New York. He's been quite much involved in the Turkish caucus, and I must say, just as a fact, that in the Turkish caucus there are quite many African American members, representatives. So from the point of view of some officials in DC, the idea might therefore be that it is not in the interest of the US to create a precedent. Because once the precedent is settled, it opens the door to other claims, and then you don't know what will be next, what's next, and you don't know what to expect. And one of the goals of the State Department officials, but not only in the State Department, but particularly in the State Department, is to avoid situations when they don't know what to expect. So recognizing the Armenian genocide may appear as opening a Pandora's box, you know, this idea of the Pandora's box. Once you open it, you don't know what is going to be next. So what could be next? From an American point of view, from the point of view of decision makers in Washington, D.C. First, it might lead to a more global recognition of the Armenian genocide, and other countries that have not recognized the Armenian genocide yet, namely the UK and Israel especially, may do it. It may also provide the Armenians with new political and legal tools to put pressure on Turkey and to possibly obtain gains from Ankara. I'm not saying that they real or good, but that might be viewed this way. And then it may also lead other groups in the US to ask for genocide recognition, or not necessarily genocide, but some sort of recognition of their suffering and so on. So I mentioned the Native Americans, African Americans, but we could also imagine that the Greeks, the Rwandans, possibly the Palestinians, also ask for some sort of recognition of, let's say, the collective suffering that they've endured, or that they are enduring for some of them. And of course, this could become a real problem, and this could generate much unknown from an American point of view. And to say it in simple words, it could become a real mess for the US. So I'm almost finished now. I'm going to conclude in a few words. So my goal today was to show that if the US has not recognized the Armenian genocide yet, it is for many different reasons, and not only because of Turkey's geopolitical importance and so on. I hope I was convincing. You'll let me know in a few minutes. In the end, I think what I don't like very much with this single argument, the geopolitical argument, is the because of Turkey part. I do not like too much this idea that if a country as the United States does not recognize a fully acknowledged historical fact, it is only because of another country, or it is only because of others. I think this because of Turkey argument has prevented us to studying seriously this important question. Even today, when I start talking of my research to people, people tend to ask me, why this topic? Why do you study this topic? If the US does not recognize the Armenian genocide, it's because of Turkey, period. Turkey's importance, Turkey's geopolitical importance, and so on, period. So it prevented us from really working on this topic. More significantly, this because of Turkey argument has tended to exonerate the US from its responsibility in this affair. And I think it's just not fair. It has also tended to reduce the question to a geopolitical and sometimes to a political question. And in my modest opinion, if I may finish with my opinion, I think it is not a geopolitical or even a political question. I think this question should not be so much about Turkey. I mean, the question of the recognition of the Armenian genocide here in the US should not be so much about Turkey. It should be about, first and foremost, the dignity of Armenian Americans, in my opinion, and also about the way the US and the international community, it's not only an American problem, the US and the international community should deal with the dark pages of history. And I'm finished. Thank you. So I guess if you have questions, I'll be happy to, or comments, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah.
In your research, have you come to any situation where the U.S. government, State Department, they use the Armenian genocide as a bargaining chip to get concessions from Turkey?
Yes, yes. Once it, yeah, I think during George W. Bush presidency, we have one sort of official occurrence of what you say. I think it was in 2005. And you're right. I mean, it's clear that in a very pragmatic way, for some people in DC, the Armenian genocide is viewed as a foreign policy tool. And the trick with this tool is that it's a sort of one shot gun or bullet. Once you've recognized, it's over. You can't use it anymore. It's one card that so you need to find, I guess, the good moment to play. So it seems that in the views of some people in DC, it's definitely the case. The Armenian genocide is viewed as a foreign policy tool. And then quite recently, a few weeks ago, Representative Liu, Ted Liu, I apologize if my pronunciation is not good, Southern California, I mean, from here, from Los Angeles, Ted Liu, in an interview, I think he said, yeah, he put pressure on Turkey. He used the Armenian genocide as a tool to put pressure on Turkey. He did it himself. He said, basically, I think it was about the Turkish invasion of northern Syria a few weeks and months ago. He said, well, if Turkey continues to behave this way, we will recognize the Armenian genocide. So I guess it was done with positive intention, but in my opinion, in my modest opinion, it's really a mistake, and that shouldn't be a sort of bargaining tool. I mean, it does not make sense. Plus, strategically speaking, I'm not sure. I mean, it's not worked. This sort of power struggle with Turkey has not worked. So, I think, yeah, it's more, to me, it's very much an American affair, an American question. If the U.S. recognizes the Armenian genocide, it's first and foremost because it should. Yeah.
This kind of goes outside of the U.S. a little bit, but let's say Turkey eased off of their denialist stance and then there was global recognition. Would there potentially be a call for reparations, and is that why Turkey is so scared of allowing this recognition to take place?
Yes, I mean, and that's definitely the point. So I'm not an expert, but I guess, yeah, one of the main reasons of Turkish denial relates to possible reparations. They fear, I guess, in Turkey, officials and possibly even the people in Turkey fear very much what reparations could be if it is recognized genocide, and if the Armenians use it, legally speaking, to go to court and to sue Turkey and so on. So that's definitely a central point. Now, I think that I don't know, but I think that some Armenian political parties will seek reparations and are already seeking reparations. That's clear. Now, I think for most of their people here, Armenian Americans, they want recognition because it's fair and because it's part of their identity. I mean, if they're here, it's partially because their family experienced genocide. So if the very country where you live, where you were born, citizen, and so on, does not recognize this important element of your identity, well, it's quite problematic. So.
Sorry, are there efforts, if any, from other minorities that were victims of the genocide, like Syrians or Chaldeans? Because that's a huge number as well, and they don't belong to a country like Armenians, I mean, per se, that could back up their claims as well, or the Greeks for that matter. So what about that?
Yes, you're right. The question of the Republic of Armenian backing up diaspora Armenians is a complex one, I'd say, but yes, that's something I need to dig more, but yes, it's clear that some Assyrians and Greeks, especially Pontic Greeks, also ask for recognition. Now, have they done it formally here in the US? I think so, but I will need to check. But yeah, maybe people are more familiar with me, more familiar with this issue than I am, of the Assyrian and Greek genocides. But I think you're right, yeah.
Julien, you brought the example of France on many occasions, and the problem with France is that, okay, formally recognized the genocide, but the question of denial, negating the genocide has not been solved. So basically now the French government says, okay, there was a genocide, you can deny this genocide safely, and
yeah.
nothing will happen to you. So, I mean, France could be also another example for the U.S. to think, okay, you know, let's recognize the genocide. Nothing will eventually happen, neither on the side of Turkey nor, you know, in France. So.
And the latest resolutions were non-binding ones here in the not the resolution, yeah, the proposals were non-binding ones. So in any case, these resolutions are only symbolical. You're right. And then, yeah, in the case of France, it'd be another step, and here in the U.S., I think it would not be acceptable this way. But yeah, in France, there is now a big debate on the fact, on the right to deny genocide, and especially the Armenian one. So we have a law preventing, giving the possibility of suing people who deny the Jewish Holocaust. But we don't have the same law in France for the Armenian genocide. So that's a sort of political struggle now in France, and it's been the case for a few years now. It was voted twice, I think. Two laws limiting, but then there is the question of freedom of speech and freedom for historians and so on. But it was voted twice, but then it was
defeated,
not accepted by the Conseil d'État, by the sort of Supreme Court, sort of. So yeah, you're right. I mean, if you ask me what would happen to the U.S. if the U.S. recognizes the Armenian genocide, frankly, my answer is nothing. What could happen to the U.S.? Nothing. I mean, I don't know. But people seem to fear to think otherwise.
One other question. You mentioned France. Germany recently accepted genocide, and they threatened all kinds of things in Germany. I don't recall being told or read anything whereby Germany suffered anything after recognizing genocide.
We will. I think you are. We would need to check. Maybe I don't know, Wolf, if you're familiar with this issue, or
I think they were very angry, but in the long run, not really.
Yes. I mean, in the case of France, I know there were some repercussions, but in the end they were limited, both in time and in intensity. I mean,
well, carrying my trend of thought is a country as mature as the United States should see between the lines that any bluff from the Turkish government is nonsense. And that geopolitical excuse is kind of overblown. I mean, they didn't even allow the American soldiers to go to Turkey when they were attacking Afghanistan. So, I mean, what is that geopolitical relevance of Turkey is kind of old news.
yeah, but still, people in the State Department, I agree with you, but people in the State Department would say, yes, but still, we don't want to take the risk, even if it's a small risk, even if there is not so much at stake. We have so many other problems and difficult issues to deal with that we don't want to take the risk, and it's easier for us to keep it this way. But I agree with you.
So, thank you very much for this very stimulating talk. I really appreciate it. I think the conversation that we've been having right now just affirms your realization that the geopolitical argument is limited, because really nothing would happen to the United States, so why not? And this is where your idea of it setting a precedent, I think, is really very very important. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the sources that you have found to help support this approach.
So at that stage, mostly a few interviews, not enough, I must say, but I'm going to Washington, D.C. in a few weeks, and I have a few other interviews to make. Then a few archival materials, but I'm still working on the archives. But I was fortunate enough to work in Bob Dole's, Senator Dole's archives a few weeks or months ago now, and I found a few information basically showing that the geopolitical argument, even in the 80s, late 80s, at the very end of the Soviet Union and so on, was not so central. And then that's it at the moment. So you're making a point. I mean, methodologically speaking, it's difficult to find ways to prove this. And I guess sometimes people are not completely conscious of the many reasons why they're making a point or making a decision. So it's difficult.
Hi Julien, thank you. I had a question about the Obama, about the Obama administration period. Recently, Samantha Power and both President Obama were both very vocal about the Armenian genocide, but of course backtracked for political reasons. And I guess a few months ago, Samantha Power has been trying to make amends with this to the Armenian community, and she recently had an interview here in LA, stating about the various instances when the Obama administration almost accepted it or recognized it but did not, and cited the Turkey-Armenian protocol normalization process as the first main one. Have you encountered any information within the State Department or anything else that's a little deeper? But that's what it seems like Samantha Power had been citing as the reason to not go forward, to not ruin the relationship.
And I guess she's right. I mean, in a way, if I were cynical, and I am, I would say that there is always a good reason not to recognize the Armenian genocide. But this one is objectively speaking a good one. But again, especially in the years, 2009, 10, 11, but then we know that these protocols collapsed, and so to me, that's also something I need to study more. It's difficult to study, but to me, and I'm not the only one to put it this way, there is a sort of deep state, not only in Turkey, but also in the US. So very concretely speaking, there are people in the State Department and in other institutions too, who have been holding their position for years and sometimes decades, and who maintain their, and sometimes maintaining their the position is also a matter of almost personal credibility. I mean, when you've been firmly opposed to, let's say, the Armenian genocide recognition for decades, it's difficult at some point to say, yes, okay, fair enough, now let's recognize. So this, I won't be able to interview all these people in Department of Defense, State Department. I know I won't be able to, but I'll try, I'll do my best. I already have a few contacts. But to me, this is definitely part of the answer. And I think as scholars, we should be courageous, or crazy enough, maybe, to name people. I mean, this is, in political studies, this is the job we have to do. We have to identify who, why, how. I mean, this is, so that's what I tried to do. It seems that a few people told me that what they call the policy planning bureau in the State Department was really not anti-Armenian, but anti-recognition of the Armenian genocide. So this policy planning is definitely a place to where decisions are at least partially taken. So I don't know.
Given Turkey's immediate proximity to Syria and Syria's centrality in recent international relations, wouldn't Turkey actually really have a lot of geopolitical importance in the world? Like, I mean, the way you phrased your argument, it sounds like you're suggesting that you are suggesting that the geopolitical importance of Turkey is not as central to the debate as people suggest. But it just in my uninformed, non-scholarly opinion, it seems to me like Syria is absolutely central in world relations right now between superpowers even. US and Russia are going at it over Syria. So doesn't an advantage in Turkey actually have a lot of significant weight to it?
Yes, yes, it does. You're right. I mean, but it's always been the case. In the Cold War, it was for this geopolitical reason, then it was for this one, then another one. There is always a good reason, and you're right. I mean, I'm not saying that Turkey is not an important country on the, let's say, American chessboard. But still, I mean, you know, who and how to define the national interest of the US in the Middle East, it's extremely difficult. Who has built up this narrative of the centrality of Turkey, for example? Who and how? That's interesting to me. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm saying who and how in the 50s, 60s have we collectively accepted the idea that Turkey was the most important country in the world? I'm exaggerating. That's a question. So, okay, is Turkey important globally? Yes, of course it is, for all the reasons that I mentioned. I know that it is. I know it is. It seems to be. I know it is. Now, what about Saudi Arabia? What about Egypt? What about Russia? What about Iran? I mean, and then even if Turkey is so central, I could accept the idea that Turkey is a central country, geostrategically speaking. I could accept that. Would that mean that because the US recognizes the Armenian genocide, Turkey would withdraw from NATO, from whatever, would refuse any contact with the US, with US soldiers? I don't know. I mean, but I know that that's an argument. I know that people in DC don't want to take the risk. A few people told me that in very clear words. They might be aware that, okay, life will go on even though we recognize Armenian genocide here, but they just don't want to take a risk. They just don't want to add complication to complication. You're welcome.
Well, what about the Turkish lobby in France, specifically the Bosphorus Institute?
The what?
Bosphorus Institute Bosphore?
Institute Bosphore, that's right. Yeah, Bosphorus Institute. You're correct. I mean, lobbying in France is quite different as lobbying in the US. In the US, it's much more institutionalized. It's still sometimes a bit secret and so on, but not that much. In France, it's complex. We don't have such a legislation on lobbying. But yeah, basically, Turkey has always had some supporters in Paris and in Brussels too. Mostly in relation to trade, business, mostly. And then what else? These people indeed have been quite powerful at some point, but again, it has not prevented France to recognize it. And the Armenian lobby has been also quite active in France, although again, the concept of lobby should be handled with care when it comes to France, but still, they've been active. And yeah, and the Institut du Bosphore, Institute of Bosphorus, they continue basically their I would say the propaganda, but it's a bit excessive as a term. So, but one interesting point: when the Armenian genocide was recognized in France, all these people and groups and institutions, and that seemed extremely powerful at some point. Even when I was myself a young student, a scholar, all these people were denialist or almost, or ambiguous. Well, they all basically. We just didn't hear, we don't hear about them anymore now. Sometimes they even change their mind. I know personally some people, a few historians, were denialists, I guess, or who are not anymore.
And Julien, you should add also that now the Armenian genocide is part of the curriculum in schools,
Right.
schools, in high schools, so I think it's very different in France. I mean, the
Yeah.
population in general is very aware of the
Yes,
issue.
you're correct. Much more than in the US. Although the situation is improving to here, especially in California, but in France it's after the recognition by France. of the Armenian genocide, that the situation evolved. Even in the academia, even now you have more books. Interestingly enough, it's easier to publish a book on the Armenian genocide now than it used to be, or to organize a conference and so on. Yeah.
Okay. So
That's right.
my comment sort of follows on this young man's over here. First of all, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
You've given so many intriguing reasons of why the U.S. hasn't recognized the Armenian genocide, and I would just push you to think, if it's the next project or the sequel, about the tenacity of the trope of because of Turkey. Why is it so persistent? And I think there's more you could even do with the kinds of fears that people in the State Department or people in the State Department might not even have them. But when this trope is employed, what kinds of fears is that playing on? Does it mean that Turkey's going to let Al Qaeda come to the U.S. and destroy our way of life? I mean, I think this is part of what is there in the background that isn't being made explicit that drives it. And then the other comment I have is that I think so I found your talk extremely persuasive. I think the part about the because of Turkey trope exonerating the U.S., I would just push back on a little bit. Because I think some people, when they say because of Turkey, they aren't really saying because of the threat that Turkey poses or, playing on these fears, but because of the, cowardice of our institutions to stand up to Turkey and so on. So I wonder whether because of Turkey is a little more nuanced than what you laid out here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Martha. Well, to be honest with you, this because of Turkey point is very recent to me. I'm still articulating all these things and trying to put them together. But yeah, I will definitely push this one and try to understand it better and to nuance it better. And sometimes I even have the feeling that for people here, and possibly Armenian Americans, it's easier, if I may, it's easier to put it this way, to say it's because of Turkey. So, but again, that's fascinating, and I think it counts very much, but it's extremely hard to study. Academically speaking, it's tough. Sometimes it's more of a feeling, of an idea that you get when you talk to someone, and then you have some sort of accumulation of evidences, but
yeah, I think you played out because of Turkey to its logical conclusion, like asking, okay, so what will ultimately happen? Not much. Okay, yes, but I'm just encouraging you, pushing you even further than that, and say what is driving this, hold of this narrative.
Yeah.
Kind of along those lines, the potential consequences of recognition, however big or small they might be. I think it's also important to maybe ask the question, what would the U.S. gain in recognizing the genocide? And I mean, we know that with local politicians or congressmen, they have constituents, they hear their concerns, but on a larger U.S. level, the Armenian population in the U.S. is small in the world, so what would the gains be? I don't think, aside from just ethical and those kinds of, I don't know if it's a question, comment.
You're correct. This is the problem. This is the problem. Armenia and the Armenians does not have much to offer in a very pragmatic way, realistic way of considering international relations. You're right, the US has no interest in recognizing the Armenian genocide. There is the image, the US international image, credibility and so on, that might gain in quality and consistency, the US recognizes, so it's not completely neglectable, I'd say. But I agree, there is no There is no oil to gain, there is no geopolitical influence to gain, there is not much to gain. But it is always this debate between principles and realism, between idealism and realism. Yeah. But again, that's why in my opinion, that's why I'm saying that it should not be so much about Turkey, because in any case, I mean they've lost their Armenian lobby or whoever. It's lost. The struggle against Turkey has been lost for years already. Maybe at some point it will change, but so to me, the Armenian genocide recognition should be integrated in a reflection about the importance of memory here in the US, for US society. And I would like, again, this is my modest opinion, but I would like to see more links between African Americans, Armenians, the Jews, possibly, natives, and so on. A few months ago, I made an interview of Melina Abdullah, who is basically the leader of Black Lives Matter here in Los Angeles, and she's also a professor at Cal State Los Angeles, I think. Wonderful person, in my opinion, but she almost had no idea. Or that's what she told me. She didn't know almost anything about the Armenian genocide, and she didn't see any possible common points of interest or with the Armenian genocide. So, thank you.
I want to come back to the issue of the geopolitical position. I'm really thankful for your comment, because I think on the one hand I really like that you brought us a little away from it, to kind of including memory. But on the other hand, I would say maybe it's too easy to just kind of get rid of it. So I would really more suggesting to complicate it a little bit. And I think the comment was important because maybe it's not about gain for the US, but it's really about not complicating the relationship even further. Because right now, the US had the most complicated relationship with Turkey than it ever had, probably. Because it is about migration. I mean, it is about ISIS going through the borders via Turkey. It is about Turkey as also kind of a dictatorship now, right? I mean, we shouldn't forget this one. And so maybe it is about that the situation is so complicated right now, and I would not also add that Turkey actually went into Syria against the Kurdish fighters, which are allies of the US. So there is this very complicated relationship with the US kind of developing over the last years, and I think maybe this is also part not to put not even more burden on this relationship right now, which kind of figures the current except especially now the situation.
I completely agree with you. But in other words, I would say again that there is always a good geopolitical reason not to recognize the Armenian genocide. And Turkish diplomacy, as far as I understand it, is very, very good, very effective, very pragmatic. They use some sort of basic argument, but they use it very well. Basically, when the relation is good, they're saying, don't recognize the Armenian genocide because it will pull it off. When the relation is not so good, they say, don't recognize because it will again deteriorate and we should not take the risk at that time because our relation is important. Okay, fair enough. I agree, and that's something that I don't want to skip, not at all. But still, but I agree, I completely agree with you. Today's situation in the Middle East is extremely tense, and yeah, this is rational to say that it might be a risk to hamper again the relationship with Turkey. So that's why to me it should not be so much about Turkey also. But yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you for your conversation, and especially the focus on national recognition of the Armenian genocide. However, there are 46 states in the United States that do recognize and acknowledge. 48, thank you. That acknowledge that. Is there any value to that recognition? Clearly, national recognition is important, but is there value to the 48 recognizing it as such?
I don't think so. In a federal context, I don't think so. Symbolically speaking, it's important, especially for the people living in the States. Interestingly enough, the last two states which have not recognized the Armenian genocide are probably the most conservative ones, Mississippi and Alabama. And states whose relationship to especially African American history and memory is extremely tough. Anyway, so again, symbolically speaking, especially from an American point of view, it's important, and I guess that's some sort. It's viewed as some sort of step, especially in Armenian Americans' mind, and that's great. But internationally speaking, no, it does not count at all, I'm afraid.
I'd heard about some linguistic connections between certain Athabascan tribes and Turkic languages and other ridiculous claims that some tribes came from Turkey and other things, and other Native American and Turkish connections over the years. But I never thought that they were used for these means, these relationships. I had never.
I know.
That's very interesting.
So I have that, of course, in my notes, in my archive, personal archive. We have several instances of exchanges, cultural, also university or school exchanges between Turkey and some Native American tribes. I remember that at some point, I can't remember the year, not so long ago, I mean a few years ago, I think 14 or 17 tribes or tribes representatives came to Ankara and were welcomed in Ankara. They visited Ankara. They went also to a university. So yeah, to me it's clear that Turkey is trying to play this card too.
Yeah, I just thought it was very just nice or something.
I know that's something I'm gonna dig a bit more, but I already have a few newspaper articles and on this.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Really, really insightful and really interesting for me. I guess I'm just gonna, mirror or reflect back some of what you've said, perhaps with a slightly different frame, which is essentially you are examining third-party genocide denial as a preventive or preemptive foreign policy and domestic policy tool. That's fascinating, right? The same action is being used to promote foreign policy goals of whatever Turkey might do should we recognize the Armenian genocide, but then also guarding against any recognition and reparations claims of folks in this country. And so I think just for I don't know, I guess the elevator pitch of this, I think, is how Americans use genocide denial to promote foreign policy and domestic political agendas. I mean, this is a fantastic project.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Maybe just one word. It's not so much denial, it's non-recognition.
Non-recognition,
It's kind of subtle and ambiguous.
Small questions. Has anyone used the Ottoman judiciary accounts of 1915 or the Malta investigation 1919 to say, justice has been served, we're done? Has anyone of other states, Western states, used that as they've already done their work, they hanged whoever perpetrated whatever? I'm just curious, and that's one question. The other one is, has any Armenian or other Christian minority used the different route of restoration of Turkish citizenship, where they would actually go back to Turkey, because by law you can, and claim from within the government as a Turkish citizen? I'm just curious if that's ever been done as well.
These are two very good questions. A bit sharp to me, I must say. I'm not a specialist. I'm afraid on this specific question it'd be a bit difficult for me to answer. Especially as for the second one, the restoration one, I've read a few things, but I wouldn't be able to give you a substantial answer. So if anybody can, please don't hesitate. Maybe Manuk. And maybe just one word on your first point. I'm not sure I completely get the idea, but you're asking if the trials, the
So there
Constantinople
were
trial,
trials by the
and the Malta-
Ottomans. Yeah, the Ottomans tried their
Yeah.
own people
Yeah.
after Talat Pasha
Yeah.
sent a report.
pressured very much by the powers, but
Yeah, and did any Western power use that as an excuse of not pursuing?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But again, pursuing is almost another step. At that stage, this is just recognizing. I mean, it's even kind of amazing that we still need to there's still some need to struggle to just obtain the very utilization of the word genocide. Then no, as for suing or pursuing, I think it's never been raised. I don't think so. Manu, maybe you had a comment on the.
Yeah, but I could talk.
Okay.
I have a few small things about the second question.
Very good. Okay. So, I think
I think we have to stop now, so thank you very much.
Thank you.